There's a big storm brewing outside, and unfortunately, Saru Jayaraman got caught in that storm, and her flight was rerouted, so we're short one of the best panelists, but we have a fabulous group still. So I don't know what I'm going to do without Saru. So we're going to have to fill in. We're going to have to fill in. I know you're all here just to see Saru, but don't leave.
I was.
I was too. That was the problem. When we began yesterday, yesterday seems so long ago, but when we began yesterday, President Clinton encouraged us to think about alternative views of the future. And I came yesterday because I wanted to get a feel for this. I've never been to a CGI event, and I learned so much. And I wrote a little story that is a weave of many things that I heard and then kind of my own imagination. And I'm going to start taking us into the future. Imagine it's somewhere 2020, 2025. It's somewhere in the future. And here's Tameka Brown, who works at Detroit Wire and Steel. And she leads a team that designs and fabricates precision fittings for companies like Shinola, like Harley-Davidson, Toyota, Delta. She never imagined that she would enter advanced manufacturing when she was actually a high school dropout, but she managed to get her diploma online and some good career counseling, and she started out at Detroit Wire and Steel in a reasonably good job, but immediately entered their training program and learned advanced manufacturing. And then there's Carlos Rodriguez, who at Mercy Hospital was in the dietary division, pretty lower level frontline worker, but he became very concerned about the patients that were not getting nutritious food, not getting their meals at times that made the most sense for the patients. So he teamed up with the IT department at Mercy Hospital. He had the courage and the ingenuity to do that, and they created an app for the hospital for patients to be able to get food on demand, and then that became a business that grew to hundreds of hospitals across the United States. And then there's Dana Hopkins, who lives in eastern Kentucky, and Dana had an idea, and she became part of a co-workers hub, and there she hatched this idea, Suitable, and it's a platform that she developed teaming up with the National Diaper Bank, she built a customer base of those who were kind of labeled as very hard to serve, high barrier employees, and created an online on-demand attire for business coaching and job matching service that's now all over the country. So Dana used the idea of platforms in this rural eastern Kentucky community that's now connecting people to jobs all over the country. So what do these people have in common? What could they possibly have in common? Somebody in manufacturing, somebody developing a platform company. They all, in 2020 plus, they all love their jobs. They love their jobs. And moreover, they feel really confident in the jobs that they have, that they can put food on the table, that they can put a roof over their head, that they can provide health care for their kids, not just now in the jobs that they have now, but throughout the trajectory of their career that's going to have all sorts of twists and bends and stops and starts and on-ramps and off-ramps. They love their job. They feel confident in their job. They feel very competent to manage to navigate those twists and turns and bends. They can navigate a lifelong career because they have the competence to navigate that career. And they're not alone. The tide turned in 2018, somewhere around 2018, where the Conference Board, for the first time, reported in their job satisfaction survey that the majority of Americans like their jobs, are satisfied with their jobs. And that was a big shift around 2018. The labor market participation really started to skyrocket. People felt great about what they were doing. This happened at the confluence of important changes, a new generational shift that really had a very different view and a refreshing idea of what the role of business is in society and what business could accomplish. At the same time, these rapid and unprecedented changes in technology made all sorts of things possible that weren't possible before. And finally, and probably the most important, the wealth gap that had been mounting in America, threatening our very social and economic fabric, just couldn't continue. It just couldn't continue, and we had to do something about it. It was the sum total of thousands and thousands of innovations, business operations and strategy innovations with companies like Shinola showing us that good business and good jobs really are equate. And labor market organizations that Saru was going to talk about that created very different and very powerful approaches to provide worker voice and consumer choice, and really aggregating that and moving this whole structure of incentives that drive a lot of business practices. And finally, well, not finally, but another piece was public policy, where our 20th century industrial policies were retrofitted to fit a 21st century environment where that core compact of ensuring fair labor, worker safety, worker health was not only secured but was strengthened, but in a context that was framed by portability and mobility and flexibility, a very different framing, but ensuring that security. And finally, fundamental shifts in capital markets, where investors, lenders, Bank of California, are you still out there, were looking at businesses by looking at the level of risk and the level of potential for businesses by virtue of the kinds of labor force practices that they maintained, and were investing in good companies that created good jobs because that was good for business and good for their bottom line. So these were the changes that happened. This is where we were. This is where we will be. But I'm going to dial it back now to the present. Mm-hmm. That's a little story about the future. Dial it back to the present. And look at one of the companies that in my little story about the future was influential in that future. And ask you, Tom Kartsotis, tell us now about Shinola, why you created the company, why Detroit, a little bit of the history so that our audience can have a sense of the company. And then I'm going to ask you another question after that.
So when I was in my early 20s, in the 80s, I started another company and was fortunate enough to take it public in '93, and I continued to work there for a total of 26 years and hadn't really thought about what I was going to do when I left that job. So when I was over, I sat with my wife, and my kids were teenagers, and I asked her, I said, do we really want to leave all this money to these kids? The answer was no.
Your kids are watching, Tom, don't forget.
Sorry, Annie and Jack. So we started investing in projects that were creating jobs in the United States. And one of several things that we had thought was if we could build a watch factory in Detroit and train 100 workers to make watches for other watch companies, that would create 100 jobs, and it would be a wonderful thing. It'd be fun, it'd be sport. So it's the beginning of 11. It took about a year and a half to get the factory built. So it's May of 2012, factory's built, and then we had to start to train the workers. So if there's anything crazy we did, we had to actually build the factory before we had proof of concept that we could train the workforce in Detroit to make a competitive product. So March of 13, we get proof of concept that the watch movements that we're making are of high quality, and we needed to make some watches to show our customers, who were going to be other watch companies, the quality of what we could make. And so we bought parts for 2,500 of our original watch that would be coming in 4 months. And we ran an ad in the newspaper asking customers to pay $550 4 months in advance for a watch that nobody had ever seen before. We were barely sure we could make it. And it said Shinola on it. So we didn't really feel like we were going to sell a lot of these watches. What we thought was that the parts would come in, the factory would go live, the workers would start working on real product, and we'd have something to show Tiffany and Movado and people what kind of quality we could make. And we were surprised when the watches sold out in a matter of a few days, and we abandoned the idea of making watches for other people, and we just started looking for other product categories that had some small defined market in the United States, or with capital and innovation and brand, that we could perhaps expand those businesses and create more jobs.
So this was a big risk that you took. You had no idea where it was going to end up, but here you were creating these watches with a larger vision, which is you're going to bring manufacturing to Detroit and create good quality jobs. Can you tell us a little bit about, maybe describe a worker that is in your company, and to give us a more concrete picture? I made up these workers, but a concrete picture of what a good job looks like from the point of view of a worker?
Yeah, we have all sorts of people. A person that was the security guard in the building where our factory is applied to join, and he's one of our line leaders. When you visited, there's a pizza delivery guy that you met. There's an interesting story. There's a girl named Crystal who joined us in May of 2012 when we opened our factory, and she worked nights. She was the janitor. She cleaned the floors. And President Clinton was going to visit the factory, and we asked the president's handlers if we could give him a watch, and our marketing person told me, yeah, we could give him a watch. And so I said, okay, which employee should have the honor of giving the president a watch? And everybody was like, Crystal. And I didn't really know the story. I like, Crystal? And they go, yeah, you don't know? And I go, no. So evidently, she took the test to see if she could make the watches. There's a test that measures, I guess, vision, patience, and dexterity, and she did well, and she became a line leader. And they said, you really don't know this story? And I go, no, I don't. And they took me to a room that's probably, 1,500 square feet. At that time, there were 14 employees, and I think today there's 26. And all these people now report to Crystal. So in a matter of a few years, 3 years to be exact, she went from cleaning the floors at night to now she has 26 employees, and she's an integral part of the company. And so during the tour with President Clinton, at the end of it, I was like, okay, Crystal, tell me your story. And so she goes through the story, and it was just the president and myself around the back where the watchmakers were, and I could see that he was moved by this story, and it hit me at that moment that actually this brand is being built from the inside. I mean, there's 20 stories just like that. So,
Brand is being built from the inside with this incredible talent that you've been able to unleash. Otherwise, people might have just kind of written Crystal off, right? But here you were building this brand with the quality of the people that you had, and you recognized something in Crystal that really made this all possible. Secretary Perez, you've been traveling around the country. Mm-hmm. You're active in all sorts of ways. You're active in the conscious capitalism movement, if it's a movement. You've been looking at companies that are doing the kinds of things that we're seeing at Shinola. Can you give us your picture from what you've seen in your travels of good companies, good jobs, and what they look like and why they do what they do?
Well, Barbara, here's the bottom line. You talked about this futuristic world, and as I was listening to you, that the future is now. I see this in my travels all across America. I was in Pikeville, Kentucky, coal country. We met 15 coal miners who had lost their jobs and probably weren't getting them back. And they were at a company called BitSource. BitSource is a startup. We help fund the training for these employees. And their motto is from coal to code. And I met people who were there who had never turned a computer on in their life. And the one guy said, I got called from my company last week. They offered me my job back at the coal mine. I said no, because I have a brighter future here. And another guy had a screensaver shot of his 1-year-old. And he said, when this little boy grows up and says, Daddy, I can't do this, I'm going to be able to look him in the eye and say, yes, you can, because I couldn't turn a computer on, and now I am a coder. I see it in the eyes of Ladea Epps. I met her in Los Angeles. Ladea was born into poverty, grew up in foster care, went from foster care system to the criminal justice system. But she has game. She had stick-to-itiveness about her. She wanted to get a good job, and so she got into an apprenticeship program. And she aced her test. They said that she kicked butt. She kicked butt from, in a man's world, she got a job as an apprentice laborer. And she's building the light rail in Crenshaw. And when she went there, there's a photo of all the local labor that's building this light rail and her son. And she sat in the box with the First Lady a couple of years ago for the State of the Union. And she took her kids to the site of where she works, and they saw her picture, and her 3-year-old said, wow, Mommy, you must be important. And the answer is, hell yeah, she's important. And you know what? What is the most fulfilling thing? I asked her. She said, my kid just turned 15, and I was able to get him a present on his birthday. That is the dignity of work. That's the stick-to-itiveness that I see. And I meet employers, not only Tom in Detroit, but go to Detroit Manufacturing Systems. This is a place founded by a woman single mom, Native American. She went from 0 to 1,200 employees with the help of the workforce system. And she is now the largest provider. They make the console for the Ford F-150, the best-selling truck in America. This is not an ad for Ford. That's just a statement of fact. And she went from 0 to 1,200. Some of her workers are veterans. Some of them have a criminal history. All of them have talent. And it really embodies the value of stick-to-itiveness. It really embodies the values I see in the businesses that I meet. And I was out with the farm workers on the West Coast, a project called the Equitable Farm Initiative. And I met with farmers, growers. I met with folks from Costco and Whole Foods. It is a partnership between folks who understand the stakeholder model of governance. Shareholders are best served when all stakeholders are well served. So when I go to Costco, and my Costco card is so old, I had hair when I had that car, and when I buy strawberries at Costco, I am excited about the fact that the person who picked those strawberries was treated fairly, can feed his or her family, is not breathing pesticides. That is the stakeholder model of governance. And so we need to scale it, Barbara, because while I see this, I also meet people, like the woman I met in the Fight for 15 movement in Detroit. And the night before I met her, she and her 3 kids slept in her car because their rat-infested apartment was declared uninhabitable. So I see America at its best, and there are days when I see America at its worst. But I have an unrelenting optimism because the wind is undeniably at our back. And what we need to do is make sure that this wind at our back results in shared prosperity for everyone. And that's why the commitments that were made today, the commitments that I see from businesses, from the emerging people like Rock and Saru and the Domestic Workers Alliance and labor unions like the UAW working in partnership with the big 3 automakers. So when they were at the existential crisis of 2008, they came together around shared sacrifice, and that has now led to shared prosperity. I see it everywhere across America, and that's why I'm relentlessly optimistic, because I've met the workers that Tom has talked about.
How do we lock it in? How do we scale it up? What's getting in our way?
Well, I think there's inside voice, Tom. Let's see.
I knew we wouldn't have any problems.
First, there's a number of levels there. I think our public policy has to keep up with the changing times. I speak to so many people whose rent or mortgage is less than their child care bill. I speak to so many women who are making remarkably unconscionable choices between the child that they love and the job that they need. I met a woman who's a bus driver in Connecticut. I was with a congresswoman named Rosa DeLauro one day, and we met her. Rosa is a wonderful person, a force of nature. And she had just given birth to her daughter, and 2 weeks after she gave birth to her daughter, because there is no federal paid leave in this country, she had to go back to work. And so she got on her school bus with her 2-week-old, strapped her in, and all the other little kids with the sniffles, because their moms and dads had to go to work, were putting their kids on the bus. We can do better than that as a nation. And so our public policy has to catch up. We're doing everything we can under the president's leadership to make sure that people who work overtime get paid overtime, to make sure that people get a minimum wage, because you know what? Nobody who works a full-time job in this country should have to live in poverty. And what we're doing also, and you mentioned the conscious capitalism movement, Barbara, is I spent a lot of time in business schools. I spent a lot of time with people like Kip Tindall, the CEO of the Container Store, a publicly traded company, who understands the stakeholder model of governance, because I meet company after company, leaders like Tom, who understand that when my workers do well, I do well, and you can have shared prosperity. And in fact, when you look at the best places to work in America, the Fortune Best 100, you look at the publicly traded companies that are there, they outperform their competitors by 2 or 3 to 1, because they understand that when you take care of your workers, you take care of your bottom line as well. So we're building a movement. That I'm a civil rights lawyer and a labor advocacy person, and this is about building movements. And we build movements, one community at a time. We marshal the collective power of we, and I'm seeing this growing across this country, the conscious capitalism movement, and the understanding that we can do better.
So when you say we're building a movement, what are the real forces and the incentives that are going to drive it? I mean, we have seen a decline in labor unions, for example, that have been a major source in the last century for quality jobs. What's going to replace that? What is replacing that? And the other thing is you mentioned outperformance in capital markets, though, still haven't, despite the sort of noise that we hear, but it really hasn't grown to a scale level of impact investing or investing for the triple bottom line. But ultimately, capital markets need to shift. So how do you see that happening in this? What are the forces that are going to drive this movement?
The collective power of we. I haven't given up on the labor movement. The labor movement is what brought us the middle class in America, and we need to make sure we continue. We're confronting undeniable headwinds because it's sport in places like Wisconsin to go after public sector labor unions. And people like Governor Walker, I mean, I think his parents taught him that, if you blow out your neighbor's candle, it makes your candle shine brighter. So if I can take away that teacher's pension, then you know what? Then my neighbor who doesn't have a pension, I've created an equal playing field. And you know what I say? If your neighbor doesn't have a pension, let's work to get them a job that will give them a pension. Let's not try to take away my neighbor's pension. And so we've got to work hard at that. And we need to, in addition, we need to shine a light on people like Tom, on companies like the Container Store, on companies like Costco. And if I had bought $1,000 in Costco stock 20 years ago, I would be far wealthier than I am now because they understand the stakeholder model of governance. And then places, if Saru were here, and I feel obligated to speak for her as well, there's remarkably innovative organizing going on, whether it's domestic workers. Saru organizes the Restaurant Opportunity Center. And what they're doing is shining a light on employers who understand that the high road is the smart road. They are also marshaling the values-laden judgments of millennials so that people can make informed choices. I know where I live that if I knew that restaurant A was mistreating its workers and restaurant B was treating its workers fairly, that is a data point that would inform my decisions. And as a result, they're marshaling that collective power of wisdom and empowering consumers to be conscious consumers. And so I see that everywhere. And I see the Fight for 15 movement. People laughed at that 3 years ago. They laughed at SEIU when they led that. $15, that's pie in the sky. We now have 20% of the nation's population living in states or localities that have passed or will soon pass a $15 minimum wage. And the Fight for 15 movement, folks, is more than about a number. It's about the fight for dignity. It's about the fight for worker voice. It's about making sure that workers have a seat at the table because you know what? If you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. And we've got to understand that.
I'm going to have to remember next time to ask you a question about something you actually care about. I want to just broaden the picture a little bit. And we've been in a number of settings together where the topic was the digital economy and the gig economy and the independent worker economy. And I don't want to exclude you in this because I'd love to hear what you have to say, but I think we wouldn't have completed this conversation unless we brought that into the picture. What is a quality job in that world? Because so much of the context still is about this sort of singular relationship between the employer and an employee like employer like Shinola.
Sure.
But give us your perspective on that future, which I tried to paint in my picture of now and the future. But
well, we had a 3-day conversation entitled "The Future of Work" at the Department of Labor last December. And we've been doing a lot of work with the Aspen Institute, and I've been doing a lot of work with Senator Mark Warner, who's been doing a lot of thinking about this. And the one thing about this is it's important to understand that the current so-called gig economy is about 1 to 1.5% of the overall economy. It's a conspicuous 1 to 1.5%. It's also important, I think, to keep in mind that gig work didn't just begin 3 years ago. If anyone who's in the construction industry, that's been kind of a gig economy for a long time. And it seems to me that the question presented is, how do we accommodate the desire, and it's an understandable and laudable desire for people to have flexibility and control over their own destiny, with the need for that social safety net? Because it's great to have flexibility and independence until you get in a car wreck. And then if you don't have workers' comp or health care, you're kind of in a world of hurt. And that's why I've always been befuddled at Republican opposition to the ACA, because the Affordable Care Act is a linchpin of the gig economy, because you can have portability. And I have been really appreciative of efforts of people like Alan Kruger of Princeton and people like David Rolfe and Nick Hanauer, who are talking about things like portable benefits, talking about, how do we build that social compact 2.0? I have more questions than answers about some of the proposals out there, but I think it is a conversation that's important to have. And to me, what I think we need to do is figure out what are our values, because we can have a conversation about whether we need a third tier independent contractor versus dependent contractor. I think what we ought to do is figure out what are our shared values, and then values can drive public policy. And to me, the most important value is we welcome and embrace innovation. That's been who we are as a country since the beginning of time. But what we need to make sure is that the innovation that we're observing now in the on-demand economy is inclusive innovation that benefits everybody. And if we don't have inclusive innovation, and rather just have innovation that benefits a few investors, then that feels more like a Gilded Age, which was not a golden age.
I'm getting in serious trouble because
wow.
it says, please wrap, and they're giving. But Tom, just one last, because it says please wrap. But Secretary Perez talks about values, and I just wouldn't want to leave without acknowledging and appreciating the values represented in your endeavor with Shinola, and the idea of moving to Detroit, bringing manufacturing into Detroit, the huge risk that you've taken. So thank you for that, and thank you all. I guess we have to stop. We could go on.